Hello there, welcome, and thank you for joining us for this, our second EDA Summit Series event on the topic of data mesh and event mesh, and on how these two emerging paradigms intersect. By the way, good news. We have two fantastic guest speakers here to share their perspective and best practices on these topics. So first up, we have Matt Aslett. Matt is Vice President and Research Director at Ventana Research, where he specializes in operational and analytical uses of data that can help businesses unlock new value. You know, Matt's got over a decade of experience as an analyst and, in fact, was a pioneer in covering emerging data platforms like NoSQL and NewSQL databases, data lakes, and cloud-based data processing. So he's a great speaker to have on the topic of data mesh. Our second guest speaker is Jesse Menning. Now, Jesse is an architect in the CTO office at Solace, where he focuses on helping organizations design integration systems, leveraging event-driven architecture and event-driven microservices. He's an expert in EDA and event mesh, and he's writing on the intersection of data mesh and event-driven architecture. So also a perfect speaker to have with us today as well. So a big thank you to both of our speakers for joining us. And I'm going to hand the presentation over to them in just a moment. But before I do, just covering some super basic housekeeping for this webcast. As you can see, it's on the Zoom platform, so very easy. You're all familiar with it. But if you come up with any questions as you listen to either of the speakers at either time, please put them in the Q&A area. You can also chat with each other. We're monitoring it all, so we'll see your comments and your suggestions, your ideas. And what we'll do later on when we do the Q&A with both speakers is I will have all of your questions ready and I'll ask as many as we can in the time available. So don't hold back. All right, that's easy. So you can now sit back and relax as I hand the presentation over to our first guest speaker, Matt Aslett.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everybody for joining this session, and thanks to Solace in particular for inviting us to be part of this event. My name is Matt Aslett. I'm the VP and Research Director at Ventana Research, and I'm going to be speaking initially today about data mesh and where it meets event mesh. So data mesh is the latest buzzword to sweep the data and analytics industry, and I remember it was probably only sort of 3 or 4 years ago, being at an event, hearing Zhamak Dehghani speaking about the concept, and immediately, was struck by it being a really interesting proposition and something that had potentially large impact, but not being entirely clear about whether or to the extent to which organizations would pick it up and how quickly they would pick it up. Fast forward to today, and it seems suddenly every vendor is talking about data mesh, and most organizations have heard of the term data mesh. The details on that are few and far between for many organizations, however. So, what exactly is it? Why would you use one? How do you adopt one? And what are the benefits and challenges that need to be considered? And, those are the questions that I'll be hoping to answer, or at least pointing you in the direction of the answers in this presentation. So the best person to turn to for a definition of data mesh is the person I already mentioned, Zhamak Dehghani, Director of Emerging Technologies at ThoughtWorks, who actually came up with the concept. And she's in the process of writing a book about data mesh, and is doing so in the public. So you can go and see the chapters as they're being written. So this is a quote here, which I took from that book, in the process of it being written, as I said, and she describes data mesh specifically as a socio-technical approach to share, access, and manage analytical data in complex and large-scale environments within or across organizations. So I think there's a few things to tease out there, and the most important for me is that data mesh refers less to the technology that's used to share, access, and manage data, and rather more to the ownership of the data and the metadata. The premise being that different sets of data and metadata should be managed and owned by different people and different domain experts within an organization, and make that data available to others across the company. So there are 4 key data mesh principles that Zhamak talks about that will help organizations understand what's different about data mesh and start thinking about how they can apply this to their organization. And I'll talk about each of those in turn, but they do all overlap and influence each other as well. But the first of those is domain-oriented data ownership. And this is the idea that a domain, business unit, department, or perhaps even a region with an organization takes responsibility and ownership of the data that's generated within that domain. And they do so to ensure that the data is fit for purpose for their own use cases, but also that it is made available to others across the organization as well. And that is then the second aspect here, or principle, which is data as a product. So, it's not just about that department, business unit using data for their own purposes or generating data for their own purposes. Clearly, there are use cases across an organization where data needs to be combined, where other business units have need from data from other departments and domains. And so the way that is enabled in a data mesh environment is through those data sets being made available as a product that can be accessed by other domains across the organization. The third aspect, which is clearly how that is done, is through a self-service data platform. Now, obviously, a lot of organizations have moved in recent years towards more self-service analytics. This is a bit of a step beyond that. It's not just about self-service access to data for analysis, but self-service access to that data as a product, to access that data, to query that data, potentially to combine that data with other data products and produce new data products. And then the fourth element is federated governance. So, in order to achieve all of this, clearly there needs to be a strong focus on data standards and governance across the organization. And that is done in a federated manner. So a lot of organizations have previously taken a more of a top-down approach to data governance. Here, obviously, you don't want complete autonomy of those domains. So you need to move to a more federated approach to data governance. And there's multiple benefits that potentially organizations can gain from data mesh. This list is not necessarily a sort of a prioritization, but there's just a look at the multiple ways that the organizations can gain benefit. Clearly one of the key areas that we think about giving different domains responsibility and ownership of their data is empowering them, giving them the power to create new analytics projects, to do new investments without necessarily having to rely on other parts of the business creating analytic infrastructure and projects for them. Also, because we're talking here about data being made available as a product and data sharing being a key element here, it's very much an approach that can encourage collaboration across different domains and business units. And I already talked about the potential to combine data sets, facilitating aggregation of data across the organization. Also, preventing data silos. This is a key problem that many organizations have had for many years and have tried different approaches to solving. And I suppose in some ways, the idea of the data mesh and domain ownership kind of suggests more silos. But of course, because the concept of sharing, the concept of data as a product is built in from the start, this is an approach which is designed to enable data to be shared across an organization, even within those business units having ownership of their data, and to prevent duplication of data, to prevent effort, to prevent arguments about who owns the latest version of a particular data set. Potentially, there's the opportunity here to reduce cost of ownership as well, in terms of reducing that duplication of effort, duplication of infrastructure as well, in order to support multiple copies of data. And obviously, clearly, there is a requirement, but also it's a potential benefit in terms of reinforcing the use of consistent policies and standards across the organization in terms of how data is stored and processed and analyzed. Now, those are some of the benefits, but I'm sure people are already thinking about the challenges that could be involved in that. And the data mesh does absolutely potentially require organizational and cultural change. And depending on the nature of your organization, that change could be significant. Again, to quote Zhamak, she talks about data mesh calling for a fundamental shift in our assumptions, architecture, technical solutions, and social structure of organizations in how we manage, use, and own analytical data. So this isn't necessarily going to be simple. And for a lot of organizations, it is going to take them to think very differently about, not just data ownership, but data access and responsibility across the organization. We're talking about here about a shift from centralized ownership of data and standards and infrastructure to a more decentralized approach. We're talking about moving perhaps from a monolithic architecture. We've seen in the years gone by a lot of organizations attempting at least to create a single source of the truth and a single data warehouse or data lake. We're moving here towards much more distributed architecture. We already talked about the previous approach to top-down governance and shifting towards a more federated governance model. And obviously, as we said as well, instead of thinking about data as an asset that's controlled by perhaps a domain, data as a product which is owned by a domain, but made available for other business units to take advantage of as well. So there are further challenges that come along with that, in addition to that cultural change. I've already touched on this. Clearly there is a requirement here for interoperability standards. If domains are responsible for their own data, then interoperability standards are going to be required to enable access to and sharing of data across domains. It also requires disciplined data governance. I talked about this. Data governance is federated, but not distributed. So there's an element here. There is a collective responsibility. We're not talking about giving those domains complete autonomy in terms of how they govern data, in terms of security and privacy enforcement and things like metadata management. Those still needed to be determined at sort of the organizational level and then federated out to the domain. So that there's some intricacies there in terms of how organizations approach that, clearly on a cultural level, but also that governance policies absolutely need to be well codified and potentially automated as well in order to do that in an efficient manner. As I mentioned, we've seen attitudes to data governance changing in recent years anyway. And I think data mesh is both sort of a beneficiary of that and also is contributing to it. And we see here one of our market assertions for this year. We see that through 2025, data governance functionality will continue to be a significant priority for data platform vendors to enable self-service data discovery, analytics, and greater business agility. So governance is evolving anyway, but data mesh absolutely is a forcing function on that. Further challenges we see, this kind of environment is going to require monitoring and enforcement of data quality service levels. Each business unit or domain will have to ensure that the data is cleansed and deduplicated and enriched and all those other aspects of data quality so that it can be consumed by other domains without them needing to get involved in downstream replication and cleansing efforts of their own. In order to do that, there needs to be not just enforcement of data quality rules and policies, but potentially some service levels being applied to ensure that everybody is keeping up with what is expected of them. It also potentially requires some technological evolution. So I already said that data mesh is about a concept rather than the technology itself, but clearly we see, I already mentioned, there's the shift here to more self-service data as a product. That may require an investment in new technologies to deliver that. There's certainly going to be some aspects of facilitating that in a more efficient manner. Clearly, already talked about collaboration being an important factor here. Again, many organizations may be pretty good at collaboration, but there are some that won't, particularly within the business units. And so there may be need for investment in technologies to facilitate that as well. And then federated governance, already talked about. Clearly, it's anything that is a potentially different approach to how things are being done today, may require investment in new technologies to actually enable that. The data mesh is platform agnostic, which is a benefit, perhaps because existing technologies can be reused, particularly existing data repositories. So your existing databases, data warehouses, data lakes can continue to exist within a data mesh environment. And I think that's something that is there's a little bit of confusion on, and because the data mesh is a truly distributed environment, and many of those technologies have been about centralization of data, there's an assumption that they can't fit together. But I think I've seen this with organizations where what they've done is apply the data mesh as an organizational concept on top of the existing or alongside their existing technology. So that is a benefit, but it's also a challenge because organizations need to think differently about how they make use of those technologies. And it also is a challenge because it means the definition of sort of data mesh, or the use of the term data mesh, let's say, is open to misuse or abuse, or it's open to vendors coming in with their own take on what data mesh is, particularly in terms of trying to sell quick fixes and products that deliver on some of these capabilities. And a significant challenge is there is no quick fix for creating a data mesh. It is a cultural and organizational change that is enabled potentially by investment in new technologies. Data mesh is not available off the shelf. And, buyer beware in particular of vendors trying to sell you a product that can deliver a data mesh. Obviously, lots of vendors out there have products that can help you create and deliver a data mesh, but there is no data mesh product. So if any, beware of anybody who's trying to sell you one, because it's snake oil, at least at this point. But more importantly, I think one of the key concepts of the data mesh is about moving away from defining your data strategy in terms of your data platform. Your data warehouse, your data lake, your data lakehouse, whatever it might be, is not your data strategy. And I think this is a problem that lots of organizations have fallen into and have actually continued to repeat as the underlying data platforms evolve, is thinking about their data strategy in terms of the platforms they are using. And I think this is what struck me initially all those years ago about data mesh and why it was interesting, is that it creates an abstraction between your strategy as an organization to take advantage of data and use analytics more efficiently within your organization, and the technology and the data platforms which help you do that. And so that is a key element. It also means that obviously some self-assembly is going to be required. You're going to be using multiple technologies to deliver on this. So what are the key components? Well, one of the key considerations, I've already said, there's multiple platforms that could be used, and that will very much depend on existing relationships, existing investments, and obviously organizations want to make best use of what they already have. But one of the key areas that companies need to think about here is how you provide access to domain-oriented data products. And really, I think there's two key approaches to that, and they can be best surmised as sort of push and pull. So you think about a part of an organization, let's say, for example, that deals particularly with customers. So they own the customer list and the customer database, and they could make that available as a data product. As that customer database is updated, potentially those changes could be distributed, could be pushed out to other parts of the organization via an event mesh, as events that are pushed out as they change. Alternatively, you could make that customer database available, and you could obviously update it on an ongoing basis, and then parts of the business could come and pull data or pull their analysis from that environment as and when it was required. through creating sort of SQL or spinning up SQL query engines, to then do their analysis of that data, as I said, as it makes sense for them to do so for their needs, and perhaps even to combine with other data that they have or from other parts of the organization. Now, I think it's important, whilst I said that those are the two key sort of approaches as I see it, that they're not mutually exclusive. Clearly, there are some parts of the business that may require a constant update of that customer list, and we'll need to know in real time as that customer list changes. There are other parts of the business where they just, as and when they need it, they want to go, and as long as they know it's up to date at that point, that will be good enough for their needs. So even within a single domain, there will be multiple ways in which they need to provide access to that data. And indeed, I think offering multiple approaches to accessing data is indeed key to the concept of data mesh as well. So frequency of analysis is going to be one of the key ways in which organizations can think about this. More frequent analysis requires organizations to reduce the time taken to make decisions based on data, shrinking the time between the generation of data and insights. We see that less than a quarter of organizations today say they're analyzing data in real time. I think if that business or indeed a specific domain has a need for analyzing data in real time, then the event-based approach will make sense in that case. As I said, perhaps for other parts of the business, the need is not so, or the need for free analysis is not so frequent, and you can look at other approaches. So I know as we continue here, we're going to talk in more detail about event mesh itself and the role that it has to play as an enabler of data mesh. But I think it's interesting in the context of this description, and again, I'm quoting Zermatt here, and she talks about business facts being best presented as business domain events that can be stored and served as distributed logs of time-stamped events for any authorized consumer to access. So I think, clearly the paradigm of events is integral to data mesh. Those events may actually trigger query-based access to a data product rather than, being event-based access. But clearly, either way, events and event-driven architecture has a significant role to play in enabling data mesh. And again, one of our market assertions, that we made this year, we see that through 2026, approaches to data operations will continue to evolve as organizations adapt their cultural and organizational approaches to data ownership in the context of event-driven architecture and microservices. So, I think it's important here, you've got this concept of the data mesh, you've got the, organizations moving towards event-driven architecture and microservices. The two clearly overlap and can draw from each other. They're not, as I said, you don't need to adopt event-driven architecture, perhaps to adopt data mesh, but it clearly is a key part of the concept, and we see that many organizations who are moving towards event-driven architecture are more attracted to data mesh as well. So the two are definitely sort of trends that are running in parallel and overlapping. So just to sum up here with just a sort of a key recommendation for organizations, we'd say, and this is often the case, consider the business benefits and the technology requirements, and also I think importantly in relation to data mesh, because it is an organizational concept, consider them separately but in unison, if you like. So all organizations should should consider the potential advantages that may result from adopting a data mesh approach. It may be you look at it and you figure out it's not for you, but I think it's definitely a very interesting concept that has many potential benefits, and it's well worth consideration. Of course, if you're looking at the potential benefits, you have to do so while being cognizant of that it is going to involve potentially significant organizational and cultural changes. And you can consider those organizational cultural changes separately from technological change, particularly in relation to the fact that data mesh does enable you to potentially make ongoing use of existing investments in data platforms. But I think beware of the cultural and organizational approaches to data ownership in the context of ongoing evolution of data architecture and the adoption of event-driven architecture and microservices in particular. And with that, I'll thank you for your time. There's there's a lot of links here. If you're interested in learning more about our approach to analytics and data and our research, or finding us on social media, please do so. But with that, I will hand you back to Mark. So thank you very much for your time.
Matt, thank you so much. That was fascinating. A real deep dive and a great overview of data mesh and its benefits, but also, I guess, the challenges, which are not only technical, but organizational and cultural as well. Lots to think about there. And by the way, you guys were thinking, because I saw some great questions coming in. We will get a chance to ask Matt your questions alongside Jesse in a little while. But before we get to our second speaker, let's do a polling question. Now, it should pop up on your screen. Have a look at the question and the options, and then just basically give us your thoughts. So the question is, let's see, here we go. Do you currently use or plan to implement a data mesh in your organization? You got 4 choices. We have no plans, number 1. Thanks for being here anyway. Number 2, we currently have pilot implementation, right? Number 3, we currently use a data mesh in production environments. And choice number 4, we have plans to implement in the next 1 or 2 years. And maybe your mind's just been changed by what you heard Matt sharing with you, one way or the other. Okay, so the polling question is happening right now. I am glancing at the results. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds, and then let's see where we are. So, all right, let's see, just over half of you have answered, and we are seeing right now that plans to implement data mesh in the next 1 to 2 years, that is absolutely number 1 choice in our little polling question. Interestingly, only 4% of you are currently in. You currently use a data mesh in production environments, so that's a very low number. Thank you for taking part in the polling question. Good to know, good to get that information. I'm going to clear my screen so I can see your questions. All right, let's get to our second speaker now. It is, of course, Jesse. I introduced him earlier. Jesse's going to talk about how an event-driven data mesh can address some of these challenges now and, of course, into the future. So, with no further ado, Jesse, please take it away.
All right. Thank you, Mark, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to Matt for the fantastic overview of data mesh as a general concept. So following on from Matt, I think event-driven data mesh can be the solution for a lot of different organizations. It might not. Obviously, there's lots of different ways to attack data mesh, but I feel like event-driven data mesh has a lot of nice qualities and is actually maturing as we speak towards a more fully fledged solution for a lot of enterprises. So without further ado, let's dive in. Let's check out the capabilities of event-driven data mesh and where they sit today. So we'll first look at things that are mature, things that event-driven architecture has done really well for a long time, and now has been able to transfer those abilities over into an event-driven data mesh. So we'll touch on those things. But I think the more exciting things are the emerging capabilities, things that in the past event-driven architecture has not handled that well and now is starting to come into its own about. In particular, things that reflect more of a synchronous API world. Now that event-driven architecture has adopted those, we can bring those to event-driven data mesh as well. And then finally, we'll wrap up with things on the horizon. And those are the really things that are exciting to me as we sort of reach beyond what we can do today and present a more fully featured solution to the event-driven data mesh problem. So looking forward to covering all this with you today. So we'll start with the mature capabilities. And this is actually a really great time to talk about more conceptually what an event-driven data mesh might potentially look like. Here are some capabilities, feeding real-time analytics. I think Matt did a very good job of discussing why moving towards real-time analytics has become important in the face of modern challenges. And that also implies lots of data coming at you very, very fast. And event-driven data mesh does well at handling those. And then moving into sort of the connectivity pieces of it. We want things that are platform agnostic and also very interoperable to help move things forward. But we'll start at the very beginning, sort of a very high-level conceptual view of what an event-driven data mesh could potentially look like. And I think it's important to start off from the beginning saying, traditionally, event-driven architecture has happened at the transactional layer. Someone buys something in a store, someone creates a product, they need to ship it, any number of different things. Those are transactions. There are, a person is doing something, and as a result, an event happens. And I think there's a tendency to say, well, this is fantastic. We'll use the transactional layer. We'll slap some CDC, some change data capture on that particular database and move forward, and bang, we have data mesh. I think that would be a mistake. I think it's been demonstrated time and time again that things that are transactional in nature don't always necessarily make the best analytical data. They need to be enriched, they need to be simplified, they need to be contextualized. And I think that's why it's important to take a step back and really think about what your domain data products look like. And that means potentially providing access in a different way, potentially formatting them in a different way, essentially creating a secondary layer, the analytical layer, the data mesh layer, to how those those business domain events live. And so that is sort of the reflection moving down, away from the transactional layer, down a layer into a layer dedicated to more analytical use cases. And that's actually where I think CDC actually can be helpful. Once this new business domain event is created, CDC can help you move that event away from your particular domain onto a event broker, which is the second piece that's really essential, I feel like, for a data mesh, event-driven data mesh. And that is where the magic happens in terms of distribution. Who is interested in this event? How can we get that to them as fast as possible in a very micro-targeted kind of way? And you can see downstream, consuming events bring those business domain events in, and then can use them for their own particular analyses. And that has always been, that sort of rapid real-time movement of data has been the hallmark of event-driven architecture from the beginning, and can bring that to data mesh as well, which I think is really, really intriguing as we sort of shorten the analytical time spans away from huge batches that run every week, every day, down to monthly to to daily to hourly to minute by minute analysis. So that's the overview, and I think one of the major selling points of a event-driven data mesh. That type of architecture also brings with it a flood of data. You can imagine, rather than a daily or hourly batch file, having things constantly sent out at a very small incremental level really can potentially put a flood of data into your system. So I think having an event-driven data mesh helps handle that by being able to micro-target domain data products as they move downstream. Through smart filtering, you can have potentially domains that only want APAC data. I only care about Asia. That's the only thing that I need to analyze. Or potentially only online sales could be directed to another business domain. So having a middleman in the middle that can direct the data products correctly is a really strong selling point for event-driven data mesh. And now we move into sort of the connectivity pieces. What we don't want to have is for each individual domain to be in charge of figuring out how to distribute their data products around the enterprise, because that puts a huge burden on your business domains. What you want to do is have your business domains be able to say, this is what I got. If whoever's interested in it, come and grab it, and I'll give it to you as soon as I can create it. So having this platform agnostic connectivity, whether that's either global agnostic connectivity, if the shipping department over in Asia needs to provide analytical data over to the operations center in Europe, that should be seamless. There should be no geographical knowledge of either over in Asia or in Europe. And likewise, it should be very transparent whether or not things are on premises or in the cloud. And so by grouping event brokers together, you can create a sort of logical mesh, data mesh, of brokers that can seamlessly move that information around the world and take away the routing dynamics from the business domains, because they got business stuff to do. And likewise, once the event arrives for a particular consuming domain, you don't want to have the complexities of, well, the event's here, but I can't handle it. In other words, I kind of only can do REST right now, or, oh, I'm a Java client, I can only do JMS, or, I'm newfangled, I can only do MQTT. What event brokers allow you to do is support these interoperability standards, and whatever your clients are coming to you with, be able to read these events off and establish that connectivity. Again, there's another layer of abstraction away from the sender needs to know exactly what the receiver can handle, and I'm going to custom code it to it. By allowing that the abstraction away from the sender and receiver, you allow the data products that you're creating and really investing in to have more impact in your organization, because they're more valuable and they're more easy to use. And I think interesting, and coming down the pike, is a little bit further along than the actual physical transport protocol standards, are sort of the higher level API standards, things like cloud events that create standard metadata across different broker technologies, and also async API that allows you to really tightly define the interface that your data product is using. In other words, what type of underlying data format do we have? Where can I access this? What should I, how can I anticipate sort of the topic structure behind these events? So I think we're moving towards, and especially with the protocols, giving a wide range of connectivity options for existing and new applications as they come down the line. So that's all great. Event-driven architecture has sort of nailed those. That's what event-driven architecture has been built around, and event-driven data mesh sort of acquires and inherits those capabilities. Now we'll look at some more emerging capabilities that have come along in the last couple of years, and are, as an event-driven architecture enthusiast, something that's these are exciting to me as well. And I think if there's one sort of overarching theme, is that we have taken good ideas from synchronous data products in synchronous APIs and brought them over into event-driven data products and event-driven APIs. Some may call that shamelessly stealing. I think it's actually, we know a good thing when we see it. There's reasons why these things have been adopted in the synchronous world. We're just bringing them over into the event-driven world. And the first thing that comes along is cataloging, discovery, self-service of data products. Again, to create an entirely new product away from your transactional product towards an analytical data product is a lot of work. And if you are, you're creating it and sort of throwing it out there and no one's using it, probably not a worthwhile effort. And the first step towards that is being able to register and catalog these events that you've created, so you can advertise them essentially to the world. Zsomek Dehghani, as Matt said, the founder of Data Mesh, says, the ultimate sort of standard of success is use. And so this advertising of these data products is a way to get them used. And so, what you want is to be able to register them, and then the product consumers can discover them, and then ultimately allow for self-service, sort of taking out the huge infrastructure and pipeline emphasis that has traditionally been associated with data lakes, and moving it to a self-service model. And I think we'll see that theme repeat over and over and over and over again, giving the teams the tools to support themselves, as opposed to having a dedicated team that sort of, gets ticket after ticket after ticket after ticket. And if Joe doesn't like you, then Joe doesn't create your connectivity for weeks or months. Joe, the data scientist guy. So a real emphasis on self-service that we're moving towards with event-driven data mesh. And I think another strong candidate and a strong capability that's maturing within event-driven data mesh is observability. I think to the extent that we say that your analytical data is as important as your transactional data, we need to safeguard that analytical data as much as we safeguard the transactional data. What does that mean? Well, traditionally, event brokers have been sort of a black box. You throw your event in there, and then you sort of pray that it comes out on the right side, on the other side, and the broker was configured correctly. The clients are listening in the right way. They're not throwing away events in some sort of way, and everything works, which is fantastic as long as it works. I think we've talked to clients after client saying it usually works, but when it doesn't work, it's been tough to troubleshoot things. I think we're seeing an emergence of observability data, whereby once the publisher moves their event into the broker, we have observability of those events moving through the broker and then being consumed by the consumer. I think that's a potential huge win for event-driven data mesh, because it allows us to really hold both publishers and consumers responsible for the events that they're creating. And then finally, what we're seeing is a revolution in terms of the collaborative governance. And I loved what Matt was talking about in terms of the collaborative governance. And I think we can see the sort of maturity cycle for an individual enterprise here, moving from data anarchy, which is, I think, an entirely plausible solution or situation. The sort of devolution of responsibility from the sort of centralized data team down to domain teams is fantastic in theory, but it also creates a situation where there can be some anarchy involved with it. So what we need to do, as Matt said very elegantly, is move to a federated cooperative governance of data, where decisions are made by representatives of the team. Then we look more, as we sort of move to the right, about maturing those data policies. And then finally, end state, which is more, and this will be addressed in the last section, policy as code, where we take those policies and move them directly into runtime governance. And just to reiterate here, event-driven data mesh demands a shift from a centralized team of data experts to a federated team of domain owners and subject matter experts. Again, moving away from the dudes who sit in the office together and decide whether or not you get your data product in a timely manner, to people working together across domains to make it work. So as we move into this federated governance of event-driven data mesh, we really need to have task-specific tools to help us accomplish that. We covered the great things about event-driven data mesh previously. One message goes in, it gets instantly distributed amongst multiple different consumers, and that's fantastic. And we also have this potential for complex filtering that prevents a lot of unnecessary data from going downstream. But to actually understand how that entire system is operating, we need to be able to sort of take a high-level view of our event-driven data mesh. We can see an example here. Async API has developed something they call event catalog, which gives you a really nice view of how events are flowing through your entire enterprise. And as we move into even more complex scenarios, having that tooling is going to become essential. So now that we have the tooling, I think we should look even further on the horizon and see what happens next with event-driven data mesh. And in particular, what can we expect in terms of data policy? And I think a good rule of thumb is to ask yourself, can we get sued for this? And if the answer is yes, it's an enterprise data level policy. So let's label these things as gonna get sued enterprise policies. Things like access control, regulations and agreements like GDPR, confidentiality levels, PII, PHI, redactions. In other words, if we allow this sort of data to come through because it's really essential that we analyze it, but we don't want identifying information, how do we appropriately take out that identifying information? And things like encryption. How do we properly prevent prying eyes from coming in and looking at these messages? And it's interesting, traditionally, event brokers have had less concern about these types of things. In other words, we've concerned ourselves with just getting messages in and out as quickly as possible. But what's contained within the messages has been of less concern. I think as event-driven data mesh progresses, we're going to have to start caring more and more about what's inside the messages. And start thinking long and hard about the best way to implement those policies. And in addition to the gonna get sued policies, there's a host of other ones that we have to start becoming aware of and concerned about as well. Things like mandatory header metadata. A huge issue with event-driven data mesh is that we need to contextualize the data that we're receiving. We get blips of data continually over time, but how do we situate them properly? So how do we make sure that the contextualization happens? Observability requirements, topic structures. How do we make sure that things are able to be routed appropriately within the event broker? And a huge one, data quality. Through schema validation, through other analytical tools, how do we make sure that the things coming into the event-driven data mesh are worthy of being analyzed by things that are downstream? And that would also include things like non-duplication and other data quality issues. Again, traditionally, not the strong suit of event-driven architecture and event-driven data mesh in general. So how can we start getting our feet wet in terms of those policies? I would put forward that policy as code is the way to move forward there. We all know code reviews are a nightmare. Previously, I used to look at the schedule and see when one of my coworkers was not going to be there because I knew that it would be a ridiculously and overcomplicated code review. Any situation where you have to look at someone's Outlook calendar to ensure that they're not there is not a good system to move things forward through to production. We also need consistency across different domains. If we're moving authority down to the domain level, but still having enterprise level policies, we need a way of enforcing that. And not only at design time, but also at runtime. We need to make sure those policies are enforced and they can't be bypassed just because someone wanted to move things into production in a more expedient manner, or if they just screwed up and didn't enforce the policy in an appropriate way. And I think, again, another great quote here, data mesh governance heavily requires or relies on the automation of governance concerns for consistent, connected, trustworthy experience using the domain's data products. And I think that's absolutely right. And policy as a code is one good way to get there. So how do we do it? We do OPA, or at least, this was what the first Google search result was. It's a romantic comedy starring Matthew Modine, and I will absolutely watch anything with Matthew Modine. But actually, the romantic comedy approach is not the right way to enforce policy as a code. The right way is the Open Policy Agent, also known as OPA. So Open Policy Agent is a open source, open standard software product that can help us guard against data coming into or out of the event-driven data mesh and keep the data flowing in a very clean and regulated kind of way, but also in a decentralized kind of way. To summarize here, it's standard, it's open source description of enterprise policy. And it tells you what's required of events entering the data mesh. And this also gives you a fine-grained control of events leaving the data mesh. It has a very strong parallel to infrastructure as code and sort of addresses the same problems as infrastructure as code. In other words, how can we repeatably define our infrastructure in a way that we don't have to type in a whole bunch of commands and sort of do a bespoke deployment every time that we want to deploy a solution out there. Instead, it gives us a sort of a standard scripting language that can be versioned, it can be compared, it can be batch edited and source controlled over time. And perhaps most importantly, it can be used as a runtime artifact. In other words, we don't write our policies in a Microsoft Word document. Instead, we write it in the language of OPA and then import it directly into OPA that we can then use it at runtime to help govern our event-driven data mesh. So a very, very simple deployment diagram here. What happens is OPA sits out at the edges of the enterprise and intercepts requests as they come in to essentially to enter into the event-driven data mesh. OPA reaches out potentially to GitHub if we want to version things in a very sort of dynamic kind of way, and it checks down the list of what the policies are for event information entering the mesh. You can see in this case, for example, it checks to make sure that the data is valid per the schema, checks that it has mandatory headers included, and it also checks that it has sensitive information removed. If that's all true, it moves it into the event broker and then it gets distributed accordingly. And on the exit, there's also potential for checks there as well. So instead of having a sort of more ad hoc or code-based way of regulating data that comes into the event-driven data mesh, you have a standardized enterprise-level regulation of it. It could be a very clean system. It's not, to my knowledge, being put into practice anywhere, but I think it has great potential. So that, I think, is the state of event-driven data mesh right now. Taking a lot of the really nice to have things from event-driven architecture, applying it to event-driven data mesh. I think the new stuff that has come along in the last few years has been a huge boon for event-driven data mesh, and I think we have even further to go, especially in being aware of what payloads look like and regulating data as it comes into the event-driven data mesh. So with that, I'll hand it back to Mark, and thank you for your attention.
Jesse, thank you very much. Outstanding presentation. Appreciate the movie reference as well. Let's bring you both in. Jesse and Matt, welcome. I have to say, your content is obviously very compelling, and it had a lot of people thinking, and several questions have come in. So I think the way we'll run this is I'll ask the question, and whoever really wants to go for it, just jump in first. And if you interrupt, you can take turns. Does that sound good with you?
Sounds great.
Yep, sounds good.
Excellent. All right, so I'm looking at my screen here. Hallam Carter, one of our audience members, of course, says, could you speak to ownership versus stewardship in data mesh? I've encountered, he says, data management issues with perceptions stemming from functional area ownership of data that doesn't fully serve the organization.
Yeah, I can start with this one. Certainly, I think this really gets to a critical issue. As I talked about, it's one thing perhaps to give domains and organization ownership and responsibility for their data. Obviously, doing that could lead to problems if you don't also enforce that they need to share that data with other parts of the organization. And obviously, we talked about the fact that standards and standardization needs to be a part of that. So. And the third element, obviously, of data mesh is about governance and about federated governance. And that governance is not distributed. And I guess that's where the stewardship for me comes into play. There needs to be standards around stewardship. I talked about service levels as well, perhaps around data quality and about ensuring that organizations do make those those data sets available to other parts of the business.
Great. Jesse, would you add to that?
Yeah, I do think that it's and I think Matt spoke really to this in his presentation. It's a cultural shift. The stewardship. You have this great enterprise level resource, making sure that is formatted and accessible in a way that can be used across the enterprise. I think is really huge and sort of often a shift from a more territorial view of the data that you create is your data and your data alone.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to ask what I think is a sort of related question. You've covered elements of it, but there might be a bit more detail you'll throw in. Imon Bhakti said, who owns the mesh network? Is it the cloud providers or Solace in terms of egress charges? What kind of underlying network beneath the mesh in terms of bandwidth?
Since I'm the Solace guy, I'll take that first.
Go on, Jesse.
So I do think that there, again, referring back to Matt's presentation, Solace doesn't own data mesh. Certainly, we don't own cloud providers. So I do think that there is sort of a heterogeneous mix of different people who own different things.
Right.
So the cloud providers will definitely own the sort of bare metal infrastructure. Solace, if you choose to go with Solace, we would sit on top of that bare metal infrastructure, and then on top of that, even is the data mesh, I would say, level itself, the sort of more abstract level. And all three of those different levels would most likely have different organizational structures, and that would sort of vary depending on your particular organization.
Very nice. Matt, I see you nodding. Anything else, or are you good?
No, I think that's a good answer, yeah.
All right. So let's go to the question from Willem Leroux. And Willem says, data mesh is often described in context of analytical data. Is there a reason why data mesh could/should not be used for client-facing services?
Yeah, again, I'm happy to start with this one. I think actually Jesse covered this, explained this really well, actually, in the presentation there, in terms of, I mean, if you think about, I'm assuming by client-facing, we're talking about operational, transactional applications. And Jesse talked about within a particular domain, there will be work to be done to enrich that data, to potentially to simplify it. And it's I think that's within the data mesh architecture, it's the role of the domain, the responsibility of each domain to perform that work and then make a standard set available for analysis. So yes, the data will be sourced from client-facing applications, but that domain responsibility for making it suitable for analysis, is that important stepping stone in between making it available.
Matt, your answer is literally perfect because it tees up a follow-on question from CW Fung, which is, how do we then standardize and drive interoperability in data mesh? Any top tips that you would share? And Jesse, I'm happy to have you answer as well.
I think that's the key question, isn't it, here? In terms of, I talked about all the different challenges, and yeah, one of the key questions is, okay, how do you do that, and how do you enforce that? And clearly that, in some organizations, that is going to be very challenging in terms of shifting how they do things. I think a lot of organizations have been working towards more distributed architecture and more distributed, let's say, responsibilities. But for others, that is going to be challenging. And I think this is also where the balance between distributed ownership and not necessarily centralized, but a global level, perhaps federated responsibility for standards and governance and those kind of aspects. Interoperability, obviously, being a key aspect of that, is going to be essential. And that balance is really the key issue that a lot of organizations will need to deliver on in order to make data mesh actually work.
For sure. Jesse, I can see you nodding. It's like we're all just best friends here. We agree.
I know. I wish I had something to contradict. I will add on that, I think there's also the sort of people aspect of it, but then the technological interoperability as well. I do think that's where having a standardized set of tools like an event broker, or on the more synchronous side, a service mesh, help to abstract away some of the more complicated things about interoperability. How do I actually find these people that are interested in my data? That shouldn't be a concern of your data product owners. And I think also there's also frequently, even though we try to standardize this data, frequently a need for a tool set like an iPaaS or standardized transformation tools across an enterprise to sort of make that interoperability easier for these domain teams that are suddenly being asked to do a lot more than they traditionally have on the analytical data space.
These are just great tips and recommendations, so valuable for our audience. Our time is almost up. I hesitate to ask one more question, but Matt, because it was part of your presentation, see if you can do the answer in a minute or so. Asa
Okay.
Witt goes, what role should a centralized data infrastructure team play in 1, instigating, and 2, managing a data mesh-based org? You mentioned, Matt, that this paradigm could help reduce silos and duplication. So obviously, super top level.
Yeah, and I think this is actually a really critical question, because I talked in my presentation about a self-service data platform. Actually, when you look at the written work from Zermatt around this, she actually talks about a self-service data infrastructure platform. And I did miss out the word infrastructure, and that it is important here. Clearly, this relates back to the previous question about how organizations will manage that, how that will be delivered. But there is certainly a view towards again, I hesitate to use the phrase centralized, but global level data infrastructure platform team that is perhaps federated and work with the domains in order to deliver that. But one of the key things about the data mesh is that the concept is it's self-service. Obviously, a lot of companies are moving in that direction. Many will have a long way to go. So that is, again, a critical piece of the puzzle.
It's a work in progress, but the potential is huge, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think
Fantastic.
so.
All right, we will leave it there. Matt and Jesse, thank you so much. Excellent presentations, really good answers to the questions. We appreciate your time. And also, of course, a big thank you to all of you who have tuned in to our second EDA Summit Series event. We hope you found this session valuable. Now, if you missed our first session on event-driven integration, well, you can catch that on demand at edasummit.com/series. Now, our next topic in this series will be EDA in action. So do look out for details on that at the same site, edasummit.com/series. And don't forget, EDA Summit 2022 is May the 4th, and it's now open for registration. Calls for proposals to speak they are also open, and you can learn more at edasummit.com. For a sneak peek on what to expect from the day, take a look at this. All right, that's what EDA Summit looks and feels like. And of course, it's coming up May the 4th, Star Wars Day, for obvious reasons. Thanks again for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. We'll see you soon.